Her bare feet had carried her through 3 days of hell. The runaway's dress hung in tatters, her dark skin gleaming with sweat and terror as she stumbled into the clearing where death waited on horseback. The Comanche warrior's painted face revealed nothing, his lance steady in hands that had known countless battles. She had fled one kind of chains, only to face another kind of ending. "I'll do anything," she whispered, her voice breaking like glass against stone. "Don't send me back." The words hung between them like smoke from a dying fire, and something in the warrior's black eyes shifted, a recognition that would change everything. The morning sun had risen like a cruel joke over the Whitman plantation, casting long shadows across cotton fields that stretched toward a horizon Sarah had never been allowed to touch. She had awakened to the sound of Master Whitman's voice, drifting through the thin walls of the slave quarters, discussing her fate with the same casual indifference he reserved for livestock. "That buck she's been seeing. Sell him south. Make sure she knows it's her fault." The words had struck her like physical blows, each syllable driving deeper into her chest until she could barely breathe. 23 years of life, and she had never known such complete despair until that moment when love became the weapon used to destroy her. The decision had crystallized in her mind with terrifying clarity as she watched the sun climb higher, marking another day of captivity. She had seen what happened to women who lost their men to the southern markets, how they withered like flowers torn from their roots, how their eyes became empty windows looking out at nothing. Samuel's gentle hands, his whispered promises of freedom, his dreams of a cabin somewhere beyond the reach of white men's laws, all of it would be reduced to memory and regret if she remained. The overseer's whip had taught her that hope was dangerous, but losing Samuel would teach her that hopelessness was death itself. By midday, the heat had become oppressive, pressing down on the plantation like a suffocating blanket that made every breath a struggle. Sarah moved through her duties with mechanical precision, her hands picking cotton while her mind calculated distances and dangers. The other slaves sensed something different in her silence, the way she avoided their eyes and spoke only when spoken to. Old Martha, who had birthed half the children in the quarters, kept watching her with knowing eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul. "Child," she had whispered during the brief rest period, "whatever you're thinking, think it through twice." But Sarah's heart had already moved beyond thinking into the realm of pure necessity. The afternoon brought news that confirmed her worst fears. Samuel would be sold at week's end to a sugar plantation in Louisiana, a place where men died young and broken under the relentless sun. Master Whitman delivered this information with the same tone he might use to discuss the weather, his pale eyes scanning the assembled slaves for any sign of rebellion. Sarah had kept her face carefully blank, but inside, something fundamental had snapped like a rope stretched beyond its limits. The plantation that had been her prison for 23 years suddenly felt like a tomb, and she knew with absolute certainty that she would rather die free than live to see Samuel disappear into the hell of the deep south. As evening shadows began to lengthen across the fields, Sarah made her final preparations with the methodical care of someone who understood there would be no second chances. She had saved a small piece of cornbread from her meager supper, filled a gourd with water from the well, and wrapped her few possessions in a torn piece of cloth that had once been her mother's dress. The other slaves had gathered for their evening meal, their voices creating a familiar rhythm of conversation and laughter that she knew she might never hear again. The weight of leaving them, these people who had become her family in bondage, pressed against her chest like a physical pain, but the alternative was unthinkable. When full darkness finally claimed the plantation, Sarah slipped from her cabin like a shadow separating from shadow, her bare feet finding the familiar paths between the quarters and the fields. Behind her lay everything she had ever known, the graves of her parents, the faces of friends who had become sisters, the small comforts that made slavery bearable. Ahead lay the vast unknown of a continent, where a runaway slave woman had few allies and countless enemies. But as she reached the edge of the cotton fields and looked back one last time at the only home she had ever known, Sarah felt something she had never experienced before, the terrifying, exhilarating weight of her own choices. 3 days of running had stripped away everything except the animal need to survive, leaving Sarah stumbling through a landscape that seemed designed to break human will. The Texas plains stretched endlessly in every direction, an ocean of grass and scattered mesquite that offered no shelter from the sun's merciless attention. Her stolen shoes had fallen apart on the second day, leaving her feet bloody and swollen, each step a small agony that she endured because stopping meant capture or death. The water in her gourd had run out that morning, and now her tongue felt like leather in her mouth, her lips cracked and bleeding from the constant wind that carried no mercy. The pursuing dogs had lost her scent at the river crossing, but Sarah knew that other dangers stalked these empty spaces, rattlesnakes that struck without warning, coyotes that followed the scent of weakness, and the ever-present threat of the Comanche raiders who were said to appear like ghosts from the shimmering heat. She had heard the stories whispered in the slave quarters, tales of settlers found scalped and mutilated, of women carried off to fates worse than death. But even these terrors seemed preferable to the certainty of return to Whitman's plantation, where Samuel's absence would be a daily reminder of her powerlessness. The sun had reached its zenith when Sarah's legs finally betrayed her, sending her tumbling into a shallow ravine where stunted oak trees provided the first shade she had found in hours. Her body shook with exhaustion and dehydration, every muscle screaming for rest that she couldn't afford to take. Above her, buzzards circled with patient hunger, their shadows crossing her face like dark prophecies. She closed her eyes and tried to summon the strength to continue, but her reserves had been depleted beyond recovery. The cruel arithmetic of the desert was simple. She could go no further without water, and water was nowhere to be found. It was then that she heard the sound that froze her blood, the soft whisper of hoofbeats on dry grass, approaching with the steady rhythm of a predator that had found its prey. Sarah forced herself to look up through the sparse branches, and her heart nearly stopped at what she saw. A Comanche warrior sat motionless on his painted horse, his bronze skin gleaming in the dappled sunlight, his black hair adorned with feathers that stirred in the breeze. He wore no shirt, only a breechcloth and high moccasins, and across his chest were painted symbols that spoke of battles won and enemies defeated. In his right hand he held a lance tipped with steel that caught the light like a promise of death. For a long moment neither moved, predator and prey locked in a tableau that seemed to exist outside of time itself. Sarah could see her own death reflected in the warrior's dark eyes, could imagine the swift thrust of his lance ending her desperate flight in this forgotten ravine. But something in his stillness gave her hope. If he had meant to kill her immediately, surely he would have already struck. Instead, he seemed to be studying her with the same intensity that she was studying him, as if trying to solve a puzzle that had no clear answer. The buzzards continued their lazy circles overhead, waiting to see which of them would claim the prize. When Sarah finally found her voice, it emerged as barely more than a whisper, cracked and desperate, but carrying the weight of her entire soul. "I'll do anything," she said, the words scraping against her parched throat like broken glass. "Don't send me back." The plea hung in the air between them, fragile as spider silk, but strong as iron chains, and she watched as something shifted in the warrior's expression, a flicker of recognition that suggested he understood more than just her words. The lance remained steady in his grip, but his horse took a single step closer, and Sarah realized that her fate now rested in the hands of a man whose people had their own reasons to hate the white world that had enslaved her. The warrior's eyes held hers for what felt like the span of a lifetime, and in that suspended moment, Sarah saw something she had never expected to find in the gaze of a Comanche: recognition, not of her face, for they had never met, but of something deeper, something that lived in the hollow spaces between heartbeats where suffering carved its permanent marks. His horse shifted beneath him, muscles rippling like water under bronze skin, and still he did not speak, did not move the lance that could end her life with a single thrust. The desert wind carried the scent of sage and distant rain, and Sarah found herself thinking of her mother's hands, how they had trembled the last time she saw them, reaching through the auction block crowd before disappearing forever into a sea of white faces. The silence stretched between them like a bridge neither dared to cross, and Sarah felt her knees begin to shake against the hard-packed earth. She had run so far, through nights that seemed to swallow hope itself, past rivers that whispered of freedom and thorns that tore at her dress until it hung in tatters around her trembling frame. Behind her lay the plantation, where Master Crawford's whip had painted stories of pain across her back, where the overseer's eyes had followed her with a hunger that made her skin crawl like insects in the dark. Ahead lay only this moment, this choice that belonged to a man whose bronze face revealed nothing of his intentions, whose people knew their own stories of chains and broken promises. The warrior's horse took another step, and Sarah could see the intricate beadwork on his vest, the way the morning light caught the silver ornaments woven into his black hair. His hands, she noticed, bore scars, thin white lines that spoke of battles fought and survived, of a life lived on the edge of violence and loss. These were not the soft hands of men who owned other human beings, not the pale fingers that had signed papers declaring her to be property worth $800. These were the hands of someone who understood what it meant to fight for the right to exist, to breathe free air under an endless sky. "Please," she whispered again, and the words seemed to hang in the air between them like smoke from a dying fire. She thought of the dogs that would be following her trail, their baying voices growing closer with each passing hour, and of Crawford's promise that he would see her hanged before he let her escape again. The scars on her wrists from the shackles had barely healed, and she could still feel the weight of iron in her dreams, still wake to the phantom sound of chains rattling in the darkness. Freedom had been a word whispered in slave quarters, a dream passed from mouth to mouth like contraband, and now it stood before her in the form of a Comanche warrior whose silence held more power than any word she had ever heard. The lance lowered slightly, just a fraction, but enough for Sarah to draw a shaking breath into lungs that felt starved for air. The warrior's eyes moved over her face, taking in the desperation written there in lines of exhaustion and fear, the way her hands clutched at the torn fabric of her dress as if it were armor against the world's cruelty. She wondered what he saw when he looked at her. Another runaway slave, a problem to be solved, or something else entirely. The morning sun climbed higher, painting the desert in shades of gold and amber, and somewhere in the distance a hawk cried out against the vast emptiness of the sky. When he finally spoke, his voice was like gravel and honey, words in English that carried the weight of careful consideration. "You run from the white man's chains." And it was not a question, but a statement that seemed to acknowledge something fundamental about the nature of her flight. Something that connected her desperate escape to struggles that ran deeper than the color of skin or the accident of birth. Sarah nodded, unable to trust her voice, and felt tears she had been holding back for days finally spill down her cheeks like rain on drought-cracked earth. The warrior dismounted in one fluid motion, his moccasined feet touching the ground with barely a whisper of sound. And she saw that he was taller than she had imagined, his presence filling the space around them with a quiet authority that spoke of leadership earned through trial and loss. His horse, a magnificent paint with eyes like dark pools, stood perfectly still as if understanding the gravity of this moment, this crossroads where two worlds of suffering might find common ground in the vast loneliness of the frontier. "My people know of chains," he said, and his words carried the weight of generations, of treaties broken and promises turned to ash. of children torn from their mothers' arms and sent to schools that tried to kill the Indian in them while leaving the shell of a human being behind. Sarah saw in his face the same haunted quality she recognized in the mirror, the look of someone who had learned too young that the world was not a place of safety or justice, but a battlefield where survival required constant vigilance and the willingness to run when running was the only choice left. The sun climbed higher, and with it came the distant sound that Sarah had been dreading, the baying of hounds carried on the morning wind like a death sentence wrapped in melody. The warrior heard it too, his head turning slightly toward the sound, and Sarah saw his jaw tighten with what might have been anger or recognition, or both. "They come for you," he said, and there was something in his voice that suggested he had heard such sounds before, had perhaps been the quarry in similar hunts, where men with guns and dogs pursued those who dared to claim their freedom. "I can't go back," Sarah whispered, and the words came out broken, desperate, carrying with them the weight of every night she had lain awake listening to the sounds of other women being dragged from their cabins. Every morning she had watched the sun rise on another day of bondage. "I'd rather die out here than go back to that place." The warrior studied her face, and she wondered if he could see the truth written there, the absolute certainty that death was preferable to the living hell of slavery, to the endless cycle of work and punishment and degradation that had been her existence for 23 years. His hand moved to a leather pouch at his belt, and from it he withdrew a small piece of dried meat, offering it to her with a gesture that spoke of understanding rather than pity. Sarah took it with trembling fingers, tasting salt and smoke and something else, kindness perhaps, or at least the absence of cruelty that had become so foreign to her experience that it felt like a miracle. "Eat," he said simply, and she did, feeling strength flow back into her body like water into a dry riverbed. The sound of the dogs grew closer, and with it came the thunder of hoofbeats, the shouts of men who had turned the hunting of human beings into a profession. The warrior looked toward the approaching sounds, then back at Sarah, and in his eyes she saw a decision being made, a choice that would ripple outward like stones thrown into still water. "You will come with me," he said, and it was not a request but a statement of fact, a declaration that seemed to shift the very foundations of the world beneath her feet. Without waiting for her response, the warrior moved with the swift efficiency of someone accustomed to making life-or-death decisions in the space between heartbeats. He gathered the reins of his horse and swung himself up into the saddle, then extended his hand down toward Sarah with a gesture that seemed to bridge not just the distance between them, but the vast gulf between their two worlds. She looked at that outstretched hand, scarred, strong, offering salvation in a form she had never imagined, and felt something inside her chest crack open like an egg, releasing emotions she had kept locked away for so long she had forgotten they existed. The baying of the hounds was closer now, close enough that she could hear the individual voices of the dogs, could picture their foam-flecked muzzles and the men who rode behind them with rifles and rope, and the absolute certainty that they had the right to own another human being. Sarah reached up and grasped the warrior's hand, feeling calluses that spoke of a life lived in harmony with horse and weapon and the endless demands of survival, and allowed herself to be pulled up behind him onto the paint's broad back. The horse moved beneath them like liquid thunder, its hooves finding purchase on stone and sand with the sure-footedness of an animal born to this harsh landscape. Sarah wrapped her arms around the warrior's waist, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steady rhythm of his breathing, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt something that might have been safety. Behind them, the voices of the pursuit grew fainter, swallowed by distance, and the warrior's knowledge of paths that existed only in the memory of those who had learned to read the desert's secret language. They rode in silence through country that seemed to exist outside of time, past mesas that rose like ancient cathedrals and arroyos that cut through the earth like scars left by some primordial violence. The warrior guided his horse with subtle shifts of weight and pressure, moving through the landscape as if he were part of it, as if the boundary between man and horse and desert had dissolved into something larger than the sum of its parts. Sarah felt the sun on her back, felt the wind in her hair, and realized that for the first time in her life she was moving toward something, rather than running away. As the day wore on, and the sounds of pursuit faded into memory, the warrior began to speak, his voice low and measured, telling her of his people's ways, of a life lived in harmony with the rhythms of season and storm, of children who grew up free to run beneath the endless sky. He spoke of losses, too, of buffalo herds slaughtered for their hides, of sacred lands carved up and sold to men who saw only profit in the earth's abundance, of a way of life that was disappearing like smoke in the wind. Sarah listened and understood that his offer of sanctuary came not from pity, but from recognition, from the knowledge that they were both refugees from a world that had no place for those who refused to be broken. When the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of fire and gold, the warrior guided his horse toward a hidden canyon where water trickled down stone walls and cottonwood trees offered shade and shelter. "Here we rest," he said, dismounting and helping Sarah down from the horse's back, and she felt her legs shake as they touched solid ground. The canyon walls rose around them like protective arms, and Sarah realized that she had found something she had never dared to hope for, not just freedom from slavery, but the possibility of belonging to something larger than her own survival. The warrior built a small fire as darkness gathered in the canyon's depths, and by its light Sarah saw his face clearly for the first time, saw the strength and gentleness that lived there in equal measure, saw the recognition of shared struggle that had made him choose mercy over indifference. "What is your name?" she asked, and when he told her, "Running Wolf," she repeated it like a prayer, like a promise, like the first word of a new language she was only beginning to learn.